This video was brought to you by Skillshare. Last week, Turkey's President Erdogan went on a tour of the Middle East, visiting Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, signing lucrative investment deals in the region, and making a bit of a stir on social media by gifting every Gulf leader a TOG, Turkey's first domestically produced electric car. Now, Erdogan's recent moves here come as part of a wider diplomatic reset between Turkey and the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, who fell out in the 2010s over Turkey's support for Islamist groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood, and because of Erdogan's more general interventionist foreign policy. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Turkey fell out with the Middle East in the first place, why Erdogan has U-turned, and what this means for the region. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into what's happened recently, let's start with a bit of context. Specifically, why Turkey fell out with the Middle East in the first place. Relations between Ankara and the Gulf states first started deteriorating in 2011 with the Arab Spring, largely because Erdogan decided to support the various upstart Islamist groups that challenged the incumbent governments across the Arab world, including, most notably, the Muslim Brotherhood. For context, the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist political movement that really emerged in Egypt in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. In fact, the Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party dominated the first post-Arab Spring elections in Egypt, and its offshoots quickly emerged in other Arab Spring countries like Tunisia, Syria, and Libya. Now, as I said, Turkey supported these groups, with Erdogan presenting himself as sort of the de facto leader of the Islamist political world. But the Gulf monarchies and other North African Arab governments didn't like them so much. Now, this wasn't just because the Muslim Brotherhood and their affiliates were actively trying to overthrow some of them, but also because, especially for the Gulf monarchies, political stability has been a really hard thing to come by, which is one of the reasons the Gulf monarchies can be so controlling and autocratic. Saudi Arabia is probably the most illustrative example of this. Until really quite recently, most of the Arabian Peninsula was a desert anarchy, with multiple tribes vying for power in different regions. And the Al Saud family actually tried to form a functioning Saudi state, once in the late 18th and once in the 19th century, which is why the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia is sometimes known as the Third Saudi State. But in both instances, these states eventually collapsed. Anyway, the lack of political stability on the peninsula was terrible for the region's prosperity, and for most of the people living there. Political stability was therefore one of the Al Saud's main selling points. Most people living on the Arabian Peninsula were happy to pay their taxes to the Al Saud family and accept their diktat as long as they guaranteed stability, which they did remarkably effectively. You get the idea then. For historical reasons, the Gulf monarchies are really keen on political stability, which is why they were so annoyed at Turkey when it supported what they saw as destabilizing groups in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Things also weren't helped by Turkey's activist foreign policy. Beginning in the mid-2010s, Erdogan started sending Turkish troops into neighboring countries like Syria, Iraq, and Libya to protect what he saw as Turkey's core interests. And sometimes this would even end up with Turkey and the Gulf monarchies supporting different sides in the same conflict. In the Second Libyan Civil War, for example, Turkey supported the Government of National Accord, while Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the UAE all supported the Libyan National Army, the other main belligerent in the conflict. Turkey was also upset by the Saudi-led blockade imposed on Qatar, a close ally of Turkey, in 2017, as punishment for Qatar's support of both Iran and the revolutionary groups that emerged after the Arab Spring. Anyway, you get the idea. It's complicated. But the TLDR is that Turkey and the Middle East fell out after taking different sides on the Arab Spring. However, in the past couple of years, Erdogan has started pivoting back towards the Gulf. This pivot really began in May of last year, a couple of months after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, when Erdogan started reaching out to leaders in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Israel. Then, early this month, Erdogan did another tour of the region, visiting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, as well as penciling in a trip to Israel on Friday. So, why is Erdogan trying to buddy up to the Middle East? Well, as we see it, there are three reasons. The first is that, if we're being blunt, Turkey's Arab Spring foreign policy has been a bit of a disaster. The Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates have been unable to hold on to power anywhere, and as such, the old guard are reasserting themselves in the region. In Syria, for example, Turkey tried to topple President Bashar al-Assad by supporting various upstart rebel groups. But after over a decade of chaos and war, al-Assad has been able to cling on to power in most of Syria, largely thanks to support from Russia and Iran. Al-Assad is now even returning to the diplomatic fold. And while Erdogan has ruled out withdrawing Turkish troops from northern Syria, where they control about 5% of Syria's total territory, Turkey has quietly been trying to make amends with Assad in anticipation of his inevitable return. And in December, Turkey and Syria's defense ministers met in public for the first time in more than a decade. And this is only one example of where Turkey's provocative foreign policy created a web of unfriendly states that basically surrounded Turkey. And Erdogan became particularly anxious of this in 2020, when Saudi and Emirati air crews trained with the Greek Air Force from bases in Crete. And just a year later, France signed a bilateral security agreement with Greece, making it clear that Turkey was vastly outnumbered in the Mediterranean. It's not just foreign policy, though. The second reason is economic. As an oil-importing country with a self-inflicted currency crisis, Turkey desperately needs oil and foreign currency, especially as Turkey's recent westwards tilt threatens Turkey's hydrocarbon relationship with Russia. When looking for replacements in this regard, the Gulf states are perfect candidates. They've got more oil and dollars than they know what to do with. In this respect, Erdogan has been pretty successful. Qatar and the UAE have provided Turkey with some $20 billion in currency swap agreements recently, while Saudi Arabia deposited $5 billion into Turkey's central bank in March. This agreement also works pretty well for the Gulf states too, especially Saudi Arabia, which is trying to reduce its economic dependence on the US. Previously, Saudi Arabia used to recycle its dollars earned by oil sales by buying American exports, especially American weapons. But as Saudi-US relations deteriorate, MBS has started looking for new markets. The third and final reason, though, is the United States. As the US's interest in the Middle East wanes and its relationship with both Israel and Saudi deteriorate, regional players have started taking their security into their own hands. And so far, that's mainly involved mending bilateral relations across the region in order to reduce the risk of accidental conflict. And if Turkey's pivot is a continuation of this trend, then, well, it's probably good news for everyone who wants to see peace in the Middle East. Maybe let's not get too hopeful too soon, and we probably ought to keep an eye on this as the months and years play out. In fact, that's probably not a bad idea more generally. Things are always changing, and it feels great to stay on top of them as they do. Even within TLDR, I've recently shifted my video editing workflow from Final Cut to Premiere in order to better integrate with the Adobe products our growing team of editors prefer. Now, when I started with YouTube, I just messed around and taught myself Final Cut. But this time round, at the advice of my team, I headed over to Skillshare to take their course on the topic. Unlike when I taught myself the first time round, I was guided through the process quickly and efficiently, and barely lost any productivity as I shifted from one tool to the other. It's not just that either. You likely already knew that Skillshare had classes for things like photography, editing, and illustration, but Skillshare also has hundreds of career-focused classes too. Now, we all know at this stage that traditional jobs aren't one size fits all. I mean, I quit my full-time job in marketing so that I could take more control and do YouTube full-time. Now, that's not necessarily the path that you want to take too, but the courses on Skillshare can help you design a career that fits you. That's courses on everything from how to start a business, growing in e-commerce, how to maximize your workflow, or the course I'm taking right now on how to build a business that lasts. And if that sounds interesting, you should use our link in the description, which gives you access to all of that for free. That's right, the first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So check it out, and thanks for supporting the channel.